A Tiny Revolution features adults having adult conversations, which means adult language is probably going to be present, just so you know. Hello, my name is Kevin Miguel Garcia, and you're listening to A Tiny Revolution, a podcast featuring conversations with ordinary people living revolutionary lives. Welcome to episode 38, my friends. I'm super glad you decided to join me once again. Before we jump in, I want to give a special thank you to all of my friends who jumped on Patreon support this month. It's been really incredible to see the amount of people who are starting to catch this vision of what it means to not only consume different types of media, but also contribute to it. So if you think this podcast is worth its weight in anything, if it's worth $1 a month, a couple bucks a month, I would encourage you to go over to patreon.com and learn how you can become a supporter, a sustaining partner through giving financially one time a month. And there's also some really dope perks that go along with that. So go ahead over to patreon.com and learn how you can become a supporter today. If you were in Chicago a couple weeks ago for the Reformation Project, you know how incredible and empowering it was to be there among so many LGBTQ Christians and allies. And if you want a further experience to go along with that, I would encourage you to check out the Reformation Project's National Leadership Cohort meeting in Chicago this spring. The Leadership Development Cohort is a 4-month intensive that is going to take you not only just the biblical case for LGBTQ inclusion, but a really broad understanding of what it means to be a community organizer, of intersectional, interlocking, racial justice theology as well as queer theology. It's honestly one of the best and most robust programs that the Reformation Project offers. So I would highly encourage you, if you are someone who wants to be a better community organizer, who wants more conversations like the one you had in Chicago, or just want to get plugged into the broader queer Christian community of activists, I definitely suggest heading over to reformationproject.com/TRPLead18. It's also just on reformationproject.org, and learn more about that process. Now, the thing is, applications are due November 22nd. That's about a week and a half by the time you're going to hear this. So go ahead and knock that out. It includes a video portion, I believe. There's a lot of questions about your story, what you're already involved in, etc., etc. So get over there, get it done. And lastly, before we jump into the conversation today, I'm going to be at the GCN conference in January in Denver, Colorado, along with a bunch of my friends like Tash Holmes, Darren Calhoun, Gabriel Mutta. We're going to be leading worship with you guys this year. I'm super excited. And hopefully, God willing, and the creek don't rise, I will also have some workshops that I'll be doing. So keep an eye out for all that information. But for now, go to gcnconf.com. That's gcnconf.com and register today. Now, let's jump into the conversation. A few weeks ago, I had a conversation with my friend Darren Calhoun and was planning on releasing that interview on Monday, but then my laptop got stolen and then it just got really awkward. So Darren was gracious enough to jump back on the Skype line with me and have a totally different conversation, because who wants to have the two conversations back to back to back, right? So a little bit about Darren Calhoun. Darren is a worship leader. Darren is an artist. Darren is a social justice worker. He is a racial justice advocate. He is an amazing friend of mine, and he and I have known each other since we met at the Atlanta conference of the Reformation Project nearly 2 years ago. Darren is going to give a lot of his own background at the beginning of the interview, so I won't jump in on all of that. But in this conversation, we talk about everything from what activism looks like, what it's like going from being super non-affirming of your own identity and trying to repress it, to going through second puberty. We cover heavy topics such as HIV and sexual health, so if that's something that might be triggering for you, just be aware that that is in the conversation. Nothing too harrowing, but just a really frank talk about sexual health. I think that's all the things I need to tell you about. So thank you so much for listening, and enjoy this conversation with my friend Darren Calhoun.
I like to think of myself as an artist, as an activist, and as someone who is committed to love. And so how that extrapolates is several ways. As an artist, I've been a photographer for the past 15 years here in Chicago. So, my work as a photographer has been mostly documenting nonprofits, community organizations, and the work that they're doing here in Chicago. I've also been a part of family events like weddings and portraits and babies and all that. So I get to be a part of the parties and a part of the happy moments and the celebrations of people's lives. So making that part of my art has been awesome. The other place that my art shows up is as a musician. And I've had the pleasure of being a worship leader at Urban Village Church for the past 2 years. That's here in Chicago, and it's a church that is anti racist and a church that is LGBTQ inclusive. So it's a place where I get to bring all of myself in creating a space for people to enter into worship and to make music together. That's been a lot of fun. And then I'm also a band member in a group called The Many. And The Many is creating music that is for churches and for people who aren't in churches, that just focuses in on hope, that deals with the hard realities of our lives, and just kind of reminds us of the power of love again. Um, and then to kind of cover that whole part of being centered on love is the work I do in activism and justice seeking. I consider myself to be an intersectional justice seeker, somebody who looks at the different ways that we show up, whether that be race, whether that is our sexual orientation or our gender identity, if that is our socioeconomic status. I think all those things contribute to the story of the kind of justice that we seek in the world. And so I've had the pleasure of working with organizations like the Gay Christian Network, with the Reformation Project, or showing up at pride parades with the I'm Sorry campaign or the Make Love Louder campaign. Anything that I can be a part of where we're bringing together people who maybe don't always agree on certain issues, but where we're focusing people in on how we can make the world a better place for everybody in it. And so that's the the big picture of what keeps my world crazy and busy and not crazy, but keeps my world wild and busy. And where, we just try to do what we can with what we have.
Yeah. There's one word I wanted to focus in on. When you're describing Urban Village Church, you described it as particularly anti-racist.
Hmm.
And I think that there's a lot of churches out there who would also says like, oh, well, we're not racist, we've got black
Right.
people in our church. But like what's the distinction between like being a congregation that's anti-racist and being just a church that's not outrightly racist? Like, what does it mean to be anti-racist exactly?
Yeah. So the vast majority of people and organizations, heck, even the Ku Klux Klan would say they are quote unquote not racist. I think we have these certain caricatures of what racist means, which basically means blatantly saying derogatory terms like the N word or burning crosses or something
Mm-hmm.
like that.
Yeah.
And so a lot of people distance themselves from that, but don't get into the work of dismantling the systems that are racism and the
Mm-hmm.
culture that perpetuates the impact of racism.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's where we get into anti-racism.
Mm-hmm.
Anti-racism is a commitment to doing work to disrupt and to dismantle those kinds of systems. And the systems that I'm talking about are the legacy of white supremacy in this country. And what that means essentially is that whiteness was a thing that was created to benefit certain people who could become white, and to keep other people out. And that was primarily to make sure that only certain people could vote, only certain people could own
Mm-hmm.
land, only certain people could hold public office, those kinds of things. Now, a lot of people feel like, oh, well, all that ended, back in, plug in whatever date. But the reality is that the legacy of those policies, that the legacy of the cultures that were created out of that, all of that still has real, measurable, tangible impact. And so for our church, we're doing the work of first looking within our own institution, within our own church, and going, hey, how is racism informed our hiring practices? How is
Mm,
racism showing up, or how is oppression culture in general showing up in how we select our music from week to week? Do we
yeah.
go, oh, it's just cultural? We tend to play a certain style of music just because that's who's already here. If we keep doing that, then we'll maintain that challenge where, yeah, that's been dominant for a certain reason and for because of a certain history, and that unless we really do work to make sure we empower people of color, that the voices of people of color are centered, and that we're accountable to people of color, unless we're doing that kind of work, unless we're spending actual line item budgetary money
Hmm.
on divesting from racism, and making sure that our culture does not continue in that path. Unless we do that, it's going to happen by default, not because of anybody being a bad person or a bad actor, but because it's the default of our country.
Yeah. I I resonate so hard with that. Because like of what I see in at least like the churches that I see here in Atlanta, especially a lot of like the larger mega churches,
Hmm.
um, because when you're following the money, um,
Right.
like that's always what it comes down to in so many things. And I think along with being anti-racist, like an idea around not just for well, like in addition to race, discussing things surrounding gender equity and
Hmm.
LGBT inclusion. Like I feel like there's a lot of pastors out there who like they want to do the right thing,
Right.
but dot dot dot, you know, I am beholden to a board of possibly all white men. And
Hmm.
that board was elected by a group of mostly white parishioners,
Hmm.
who view certain things a certain way. And so it's very interesting to even dwell on it, just like that, even like how like money plays such a big role in certain church organizations who like well they want to do the right thing, they know that they are doing it, but like they're the people who keep the lights on,
Right.
um, they're not ready or they're unwilling to go the distance to bring about justice for people.
Right.
Um,
It reminds me of some churches here in Chicago that are known for being LGBT, progressive or inclusive, in the community, for being front runners and advocating for LGBTQ people and standing up for marriage equality. But the actual policy of their church does not name LGBTQ people. The church doesn't currently perform weddings, and all that's a matter of the church really kind of bowing to the pressures of the people with quote unquote the most money,
mm-hmm.
not wanting to go there. They're fine with it as a public statement and all these other things, but when it really gets down to it, sometimes those people who are holding the purse strings are in control and determining what the reality of
Mm,
that church community will be.
mm. It sucks.
Yeah.
To put it very frankly, it sucks because I think there's so many of us in the meantime that are kind of suffering, not even kind of suffering, but are suffering like the repercussions of these like non policies that exist. I'm
Right.
curious. I'm sure you've heard about church clarity, right, and the whole movement
Hmm.
there, which I think is personally really brilliant. But there's been so many. Not so. I guess it's mostly the people who are trying to live in the ambiguous, loving but not affirming. I have black friends. Don't worry, I'm not racist kind of world. Um, who are giving the most pushback against people just asking for like what do you practice? You
Right.
know, not
Right.
because it's very interesting too. Just like I want to look at some, and I think it also like begs the question for myself sometimes too. It's just like what are my own personal policies? Like what do I preach and what do I actually practice? You know, am I
Hmm.
being clear about what I believe about certain
Right.
things?
Yeah. I think there's such an opportunity for churches here, especially for non-affirming churches who want to be safe or safer spaces for LGBTQ people. Some people feel like, oh, this is an attack, or this is some kind of secret agenda to get our nonprofit status taken away. And in my conversations with the people who have created Church Clarity, as well as just looking at what the current landscape is, that I think is not a founded fear.
Mm-hmm.
But there is the real fear that if the only conversation is whether or not a church is affirming or non affirming, that the churches who are not affirming will get lumped in the same category with churches like a Westboro Baptist Church or
Yeah.
some place that's been notoriously toxic.
Mm-hmm.
And so, to that, I really want to encourage church leaders to do the work to make sure that by your actions that you don't get lumped in with those groups.
Mm-hmm.
Two of my churches are listed on the Church Clarity site. Willow Creek, that I was a volunteer worship leader at for 9 years, is listed as a clear but non-affirming church. And then my current church, Urban Village Church, which is a part of the United Methodist Church, is listed as a clear affirming church. The United Methodist denomination actually hasn't made a decision
Right.
about this issue. But because our church on our website is making very clear statements about what we believe as a community, it is showing up as being clear on the website. In contrast, Willow Creek is showing up as being clear because of uh, the statements that have been made available from the elders, as well as some of the news coverage where Willow Creek, I can't speak, as well as some of the news coverage where Willow Creek has made it clear, hey, this is what we believe. We respect LGBTQ people, and we understand that some people come to a different conclusion on this, but that Willow Creek affirms that marriage is between one man and one woman. That wasn't always the case that they were so clear about saying that.
Hmm.
I was one person who was a volunteer there for a long time and who definitely knew other volunteers who, when we came to the church, we really did look on the website and we looked for information and we looked to find out what was okay and what was not okay. And I personally told elders and told leaders, here's where I am and what's expected of me. And at that point in time, the church was not clear. And so
Hmm.
you could get one answer from one person and another answer from another person. And someone could be leading a small group or serving in the children's ministry. And it wasn't until someone else decided, oh, well, that's not okay, that you find out maybe 2, 3, 4 years into giving your hard earned life, giving
Yes.
your effort into this ministry, and then being told, oh, well, technically you don't qualify to lead in this position. I think that's disingenuous of a church to let that be the case. You don't do it on purpose, but it happens because the people who are making decisions don't have to think about this.
Yeah.
Um, so I think that if churches really are worried, then they'll have to do the work to be clear to their congregation and be accountable for what they say. Because sometimes I think they're avoiding people feeling negatively about their church because of this particular stance. And I think that says something that you're willing to hold people accountable to a certain thing, but you don't want them to actually know that they're being held accountable to it.
Yeah. It doesn't make any sense.
Right, like how does that work? And then there's one last critique that I've been hearing, saying, well, we don't want to be called non-affirming. That seems negative. We want to be called something else. And I say, well, do the work, coin the term, get it out there. But you've got to actively engage to create your own terms or to be known as something other than non-affirming. If you're going to sit in silence or sit in a passive position and just kind of wait for this new
Hmm.
nomenclature to come up, it's not going to happen. The affirming language came from churches that were doing work and said, hey, we want to be
Hmm.
affirming.
Yeah.
And by default, it made the other side, if you will, even though there's more than two sides of this, it made the other responses, quote unquote, non affirming. But I think if churches are willing to do work, because I really think that churches that would say that they're side B or hold a traditional view of marriage, just because you're side B, or just because you have a traditional view of marriage being between one man and one woman, does not mean that your church is safe for LGBTQ people.
Hmm. Yeah, I think that has to be. And uh, I think one thing people forget is that it is not really up to a congregation to say like whether they're safe or not. You know, it's not really up
Hmm.
to the person in power to say, "Oh, we're a welcoming space." I'm just like, welcoming for who? For you? For,
Right.
because like if you are creating a space that looks like you, sounds like you, walks and talks like you, but and you say, I want to be welcoming to people of color, but you don't have any people of color on the pulpit
Hmm.
um, or on your worship team, or your worship team sounds only one way. And
Hmm.
same thing with LGBTQ people. I I've remarked to churches in this area that I work with that have said like, it's one thing to say that like, people aren't coming to your church because they think that they're welcome there. They're coming there because they know that you won't say anything and kick them out.
Right.
Um, but then there's like the people like you and me, like everything you were saying in your story about giving your heart and your time and your energy to a space and your
Hmm.
resources to like people like are like I was tithing for a long time,
Hmm.
and I'm just like I gave you my money
Right.
because I thought that like I was investing in something that I had equal share in, but it turns
Right.
out that I don't. And like that's another thing that really bothers me. It's just like, if people are going to tithe their money and you're asking people to tithe their money, they deserve, an equal share in opportunities to volunteer, to lead, to serve. And that's like what's very
Right.
interesting to me is like at the end of the day, like I could care less about like what people's I mean, that's not true. I was about to say that I don't care about people's theology, but I do care about that.
Uh-huh.
But it's just at the end, like, if is it so much to want to be treated like everybody else? What a concept.
Right. Just to, you know, uh, Lisa Sharon Harper talks about how we need to be protecting and honoring the image of God in every person.
Yes, yes.
And I love that structure. I love that framework because it makes it so much less about are we protecting and honoring the integrity of the scripture. It's like, literally the scripture is about God restoring relationship with us.
Mm-hmm.
And God teaching us about who we are, created in God's image and likeness. And so I think the best way to honor scripture to and honor it to in integrity is to make sure that no matter who it is, that we're protecting the image and likeness of God that's in every
Yes,
person.
yes.
And that's the opportunity that churches can lean into,
Mm-hmm.
because the vast majority of people are not showing up at your church looking to change your interpretation of scripture.
Mm-mm.
So many people seem to be afraid of that they're worried about the Bible being thrown out the window or something. It's like, no, most LGBT people have done a lot of work to figure out where they are with the Bible, and to understand what the Bible says about these topics. Now, the conclusions that people come to will be diverse, and they won't always be the same, but that doesn't mean that we're not fully devoted followers of Christ. It
Mm-hmm.
doesn't mean that we're not willing to make sacrifices and make changes in our lives based
Mm-hmm.
on what the Holy Spirit is convicting us to do. I mean, the fact that we're trying to be a part of church is really, I think, is a testament to the fact that we believe in the gathering of believers,
Mm.
that, we want to be a part of a community and be accountable and all these other things. But yeah, accountability might look a little bit different. We can't just apply those old rules like what is the rule some of the top preachers would do where they're saying, oh, well, I won't ride in a car alone with somebody of a different gender. And it
Yeah.
was like, that's great for you, but that's not my temptation. So
Yes. Did you ever feel like I know like when I was younger, it's just like boys don't talk to girls. We're kissing, dating, goodbye. Don't
right.
don't ever be alone with a woman. And if you're gonna be alone in public. And I'm just like, word, I got this. Like I am the
Right.
most holy guy in youth group because I don't.
Exactly.
I was like,
Oh, yeah. I was in a college. It was a pretty liberal school, but the dorms were still segregated by gender.
Hmm.
And there was a very clear rule about people of different genders not being able to have overnight company.
Interesting.
And it was like during that season of my life, I was dating guys and it was zero rules for me.
Hey
I could have
yo.
a guy over and it didn't mean we're being sexual or anything, but literally because you could only think through a very gendered construct
Hmm.
of how you quote unquote keep people safe in the dorms, that it was like, oh, so what is this about? Because when you tell it to straight people, you're saying, oh, well, we don't want anything going on, but you literally have not thought about how you could apply this to people who are gay or people who
Hmm.
are not straight.
Yeah.
And it's like, just be real about it.
Yeah. That's I have a couple of friends right now who are queer Christians on conservative campuses, like
Hmm.
universities. And it's like the same thing that they're just wanting to like they're just like we literally just want to be seen.
Hmm.
And I think there's such power in um, giving voice to these very diverse identities that we're all holding on to and that we're like desperate to see. Like as like I think sometimes like I'd rather have somebody like name my identity as something that like maybe they even disagree with rather than just ignoring that I exist. Because like
Hmm.
at least that way like I'm in the room with you at that point. Because
Right.
it's so frustrating to, and I guess this goes back to like the non-clarity thing too, is like just like all the pastors who like didn't talk about the Pulse shooting, you know what I'm saying?
Hmm.
Or or any number, or like pastors who don't talk about the number of black and brown bodies that are in the streets, or like when we don't talk about the number of trans women who are being killed every year. It's
Exactly.
it's like we're at a point in our history and in our world where just like if you're not talking about the things that are actually happening, you're going to become irrelevant.
Yeah. And and again, kind of addressing the fears that sometimes drive the rationales. People say, "Oh, well, we can't talk about everything. We don't have time to name every single oppressed identity or so forth." And to that, I really want to remind people that you are talking about something. You do give time, energy, and preference to something.
Mm,
And it's most likely the culture that you're already familiar with, and the music and the styles and the news headlines and the voices and the books and the music of people that you're already familiar with. So you made time for something,
mm-hmm.
but it's gone into what you've prioritized. And the reality is that there's a lot out there, yes, and you could even call some of it infinite. But if we make life better for the people who are at the margins, everyone else benefits.
Mm,
If we would take the time to prioritize women, to
mm,
to prioritize people who are sexual and gender minorities, to
yes,
prioritize people of color,
yes.
everyone benefits.
Mm-hmm.
We don't have to worry about, oh, well, what about me and my kids and my gender, my heritage and my legacy? It's like, yeah, you still benefit.
Yeah, because we're
But now we're including a few more people in the story.
Ugh. And like it like oh, were it that simple? Because it's as simple and as complicated as that, right?
Hmm.
Because standing in front of us is whiteness. And to give a little bit of a pivot, I would love to talk about something you and I have talked about a little bit, and that's like the fact that you and I, we came out, not in our teen years, or, we
Hmm.
did, and then we, went back in the closet for a while, or became side B for a while. And now we're both at this season of our life that we both entered into like 2 years ago ish, where
Hmm.
like we're finally feeling affirmed in our identities. And now we're like trying to navigate this whole gross thing called romance. And experiencing what many have coined second adolescence. Um,
Oh yeah.
yeah, what's it been like for you trying to um, figure out who you are as an affirmed individual and then also who you are, trying to venture into a romantic partnership?
Oh, you're getting all in my Kool-Aid, Kevin.
You don't you don't have to answer anything you don't want to answer, but just like I think it's like a topic that people are interested in, and like I love talking about it personally.
Yeah. Oh, I think it's important that we talk about it. In part, for the reasons you said. As kids, I think we were socialized in this very strict world of heteronormativity, or where the only conversation we need to have around sex and adolescence and relationships are applying to heterosexual children. And so for me, I thought I was this image of perfection in some ways, that, it's like, oh no, I always treat girls appropriately and I never look
Mm-hmm.
at them in a sexualized way, and
Because
oh,
I'm
I'm
such a
doing all
good
the things.
Christian.
Right. I'm being such a disciplined Christian because I'm doing these things this way, not accounting for what my fantasy life was like, not
Yes.
accounting for where I actually was facing temptation and struggle and so forth, about being inappropriate, or any of that. Oh no, 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 that's separate.
Mm-hmm.
And I would even take it further to say that as I grew into my teen years, into my young adult years, the reality was, because sex was only ever about men and women, I was making sexual health choices that were compromising my safety, because
Mm.
I thought, oh, this isn't sex, this is falling. This isn't
Mm.
sex, this is struggling.
Yes, yeah.
And to buy condoms, or to make wiser choices about healthy and safer sex, those things would have been giving myself over to sin. And so I
Mm.
didn't do them in my early years, because again, I was surrounded by misinformation that was only informed by fear and a heterosexual worldview. And so it was years before I started owning, hey, I need to know about how HIV is transmitted. I need
Mm-hmm.
to know about, if I do decide to become sexually active, what things I should do to be safe.
Mm-hmm.
And what I see so often for LGBTQ Christians is that we're in our 30s and 40s sometimes having these conversations for the first time ever.
Yeah.
And it's a little less socially acceptable at that point. It's more awkward in high school. Everyone's talking about sex, but as when you're supposed to be a grown up, mature adult, who do you ask these questions?
Yeah.
Where do you turn for advice and so forth? So that's part of why we've been talking about second puberty, or this delayed adolescence, where people who've grown up in very conservative spaces often did not get to experience um, their 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 maturing in that regard, specifically for LGBTQ people and also for heterosexual women,
Yeah, for
because
sure.
women often get told, "Oh, you don't have a sexuality, you don't have a body, you cover up, you avoid, you try to be the most non-sexual person part possible
Mm-hmm.
until the night of your wedding. Then you flip that switch, and all of a
Mm-hmm.
sudden you're this fully mature sexual being."
Yeah, and you better fulfill all of your man's pornographic fantasies because that's your role.
Right. And if he cheats, it's your fault, or if you're not doing it right, just all these ridiculous kind of
Mm-hmm.
expectations that come up. And
Yeah.
so yeah, like I feel like as we figure out these new realities, and as people figure out what's safe and healthy and right for them, that yeah, we do have to have these conversations more, that HIV testing needs to be something that we're
Mm-hmm.
not so creeped out
100
about.
100%. And also to know, like, I was working for a nonprofit for a while, and one of our big things was taking photographs of people who were HIV positive
Mm-hmm.
and talking about the reality, like the resources that were available to people who tested positive. And like the guy who was doing our training was a leader of, I think he was like one of the field directors for AIDS Alabama.
Mm-hmm.
And he had been living with HIV for, I think, 4 years, super duper healthy, like was what I would say is undetectable, which means that like
Mm-hmm.
but I think there's so many people out there who have such a fear that just like, if I get HIV, like I'm going to lose my community. And that's simply not the case. Like there's so much of fear attached to the knowledge, I think, that people start
Mm-hmm.
to avoid getting tested for all sorts of reasons.
Yeah.
Because if you even look at the numbers surrounding HIV, it's still disproportionately high in men who have sex with men. And then you drill down those numbers, it's within African American men. And then drilling down even further, because a lot of CDC information doesn't differentiate trans women of color from this number. A lot of it's disproportionately high in trans women of color because they can't get work. And so they have to turn to sex work in order to survive.
Right. And I think that, again, this is where Christian communities should really own their impact. When we don't give space for people to name their HIV status, for us to celebrate individuals who are living with HIV, for us to be part of dispelling the myths and the misconceptions around HIV, then I think we contribute to, and I think there's even
Mm-hmm.
some numbers that are starting to show that we contribute to people not being tested. That people who go to church more are less likely to know their HIV status.
Wow.
There's numbers that are they even saying that people who are part of churches, the more active they are in church, the less likely they are to be on medication, so that they can be undetectable and eliminate their potential to pass on HIV.
Mm.
Um, like they're not on medication because of the influence of churches.
Hmm. Wow,
They
wow,
are
wow.
right, and even if they're on medication, and this one really wowed me. But one study is a small study of I want to say about 200 African American men living with HIV. It found that their T cells were lower if they were in churches, and
Shit.
that now this isn't causation. This isn't literally that that church makes your T cell counts go down.
Oh, of
But
course.
this is instead for us to look at what is the atmosphere of our church, and what's the fruit coming out of the way that we're talking about or not talking about this,
Hmm.
that's having very measurable impact on people who are in our communities. And if church is supposed to be a life-giving place, if the community of God is supposed to be something that restores people, and if that's not what's happening, then I think we really do need to pause and reconsider how we have these conversations.
Yeah.
Because HIV is not a punishment.
Mm-mm.
It's
No.
not a death sentence.
No.
It's not some kind of judgment from God, but HIV is a reality that many people live with,
Hmm.
and that if we want to be a church that is really for all people, and that a church that is a place for everyone to belong, then that too is a conversation that we'll need to grow up in, that we'll need to be confident in. But yeah, there's work to be done.
Whew, dang. Yeah. I think that was like, I could say like a lot of the same things. Like to go to like zoom out from the HIV conversation, but along the lines of like risky behavior.
Hmm.
I was in the same boat. And then also along the lines of just socially trying to figure out how do I have a healthy romantic relationship with someone where like because I think we also, because so many of us grew up in the kind of this purity culture where like we're still in some way, we kissed dating goodbye, but then we never like made up with dating. We never like we didn't
Right,
call dating up and say, "Hey, I'm sorry about that. Like, you want to try this
right.
again?" So we don't know how to date, or like how to like go and have like conversations with people. We like, it's almost
Hmm.
just like every single person, like, I swiped right. Oh my god, I found my husband. He swiped right to me too. And we have all these like conversation, or these like misconceptions about like what this is going to be like, because like the truth is like it might be the first date you go on, it might be the 500th date you go on.
Right, right.
um and even then, just like if your entire hope is built upon like just this idea of like fitting into this idea of heteronormativity of just like finding a partner, creating a family, and just like settling into your own little autonomous bubble. Like, that's not revolutionary. That's just adhering to a status quo that someone else has set up for you.
Yeah. Yeah, and this is why I appreciate some of the places that I've committed myself to working with. At the Center for Inclusivity here in Chicago, it's about expanding these kinds of conversations, and that includes having space for people to talk about non-monogamy, having space for people to talk about the different ways that they are existing in the world, if that's atheist, if that is Muslim, if that is somebody who's in a polyamorous relationship, if that's somebody who's committed to lifelong singleness, or if that's somebody who's asexual. Like, there's all kinds of ways that people like it probably often have been denied of looking at the world and being able to figure themselves out. But I think there's a need for us not to necessarily abandon what we've known, but
Right,
for
right,
us
right,
to
right.
really take a deep think and a deep look at what is good for me. How am I wired? Where are the ways that I can be a healthy and good person in the world? Um, and that certainly can be informed by scripture. That certainly can be informed by what the traditions and customs of our family of our people have been. Um, but again, the value here is that we give people space to figure this out. And so that especially means for LGBTQ people that we don't have to jump into a man woman kind of role. It's like, people always make the joke, well, which one's the man in the relationship?
Yep.
And it's like, no, think of this like eating utensils. You're asking me which one is the chopstick.
Hmm.
It's not a one-to-one comparison. So I'm not going to spend my life figuring out how to be a spoon or how to be a fork or a knife when I'm a chopstick. I'm gonna be a
Hmm.
chopstick and do what
Yes.
I do.
How about be a chopstick?
Right. It's okay. And so, there's so many ways that goes. That goes from for being a top or a bottom in a relationship. That goes
Hmm.
for how we express our gender as masculine, feminine, somewhere in between, or none of the
Right.
above. Like,
Hmm.
there's a lot out here, and we can be comfortable. We can be happy. We can feel good about where we are. But if you're asking questions, if you're not sure, there's others who are also somewhere along that journey with you, and it's a good thing to find community. It's a good thing to talk to people. It's a good thing to find another perspective, and it may just affirm what you already believed about yourself, which is fine. But it's good to know that there's other folks out there.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing I've learned in the past, 2 years is that, I mean, like, in addition to like, there's like no one way to be a Christian, there's like
Hmm.
no one way to be a queer person either. And that has
Right.
been the most freeing thing for me, especially as I've begun, exploring questions around my gender and my own gender expression. Something Sue Ann said on Matthias's podcast, I think this
Hmm.
past week, like just like really just like put something in perspective to me. Is like, her perspective, like when she was like questioning, like, why do we, call God he, him traditionally?
Hmm.
And she was questioning that, and she said, well, if God is like, both male and female, why do we do this? And like the answer she got from her campus pastor, and Suanne, if you're listening to this, I'm sorry if I butchered your story, but the real punchline of all this is that it's not that God is like equally masculine and feminine, is God is fully masculine and fully feminine, like more than just like God is the fullness of both of these things.
Yeah.
And I think that can do so much good, not only for queer relationships, but like any sort of relationship between people. So we can start breaking down these roles having to do with, uh, a certain kind of role, like a man having to be a breadwinner and a woman have to be the caregiver.
Hmm.
And then also consequently within same sex or same gender relationship, us having to fit in these particular roles at any given moment rather than just like working in a partnership that works for either person.
Exactly. There's so much potential for us to be fully ourselves. Society's always telling us that we have to cut stuff off, that we have to limit ourselves, that something that we do, or oftentimes something that we're great at. A guy who's into fashion or a woman who is very handy. Like, society will tell us to cut that off so that we can be more attractive.
Hmm. Yeah.
And the reality is, it's like, I really do think we're beautiful. I think we are created in the image of a creator who made all kinds of creations,
Hmm.
not just ones that fit into some very neat boxes so that we can stop thinking. Instead, one that challenges us to think in new ways and to see in ways we've maybe never seen before. Like, I keep referring back to Megan DeFranza
Oh my
and
gosh,
her
my favorite lecture I've ever
hello,
heard.
right? And how she talks about creation expanding, and
Hmm.
that the revelation isn't that we get back to the Garden of Eden, but that we get this new Jerusalem, this new heaven and earth that descends on where we are right now, and that
Hmm.
is much more diverse and colorful and bright and expansive than what we had in the Garden of Eden. And so it's like, wow, this keeps opening my mind to the possibilities of what could eternity look like if it's so much more expansive instead of it becoming more simplified and more narrow. So I'm like, yeah, let's live into that.
Mm. Mic drop me on the floor. That was my conversation with Darren Calhoun. You can check out Darren Calhoun online at his website, darrencalhoun.com. You can also follow him on all the social medias at Hey Darren. And on top of that, if you ever see him in public, go ahead and give him a hug, because Lord knows the man is a self-proclaimed lover of hugs. Maybe ask first, because consent is cool, that's for sure. On top of that, I would encourage you to check out Darren's band, The Many, which is, he talked about it, they're an amazing group of worshipers who are creating music and liturgies that's intersectional and encompassing of the things that we're experiencing today. I know my personal favorite off the new album is the title track, All Belong Here. I cry every single time, so if you're looking for a little bit of a cry and a good bit of inspiration, go ahead and check out The Many online at themanyAreHere.com. You can connect with me on all the social media at the Kevin Garcia. Just search me, you know how to find me. You can also connect with me over on my blog, thekevingarcia.com, on YouTube, Instagram, Twitter, the whole 9 yards. And if you think that creating queer Christian content like these conversations we're having on A Tiny Revolution is important, again, I'm going to encourage you to help us out, because, again, I am just one person producing this podcast on my own in my bedroom or in my little office at my church. And, it takes time and it takes energy, and it also takes money to host these things online. So if you are able to spare $1 a month, $2 a month, $5 a month, or $7 or $10 or maybe more than that, I would definitely encourage you to go to thekevingarcia.com/support to learn more about that, or you can just hop over to patreon.com/thekevingarcia and learn about the awesome perks associated with being a sustaining partner with this work of creating movement. Y'all, it's been so amazing to see your support, and I'm excited to see where it goes and see what we can do with all the amazing new support that we're getting. And there's also another easy way for you to support if you don't have cash to throw around. Leave me a review. Go to your podcast app and leave a review in the Apple podcast store. It seriously helps connect more people with this podcast, people who need to hear a good word about their lives. By the way, if you are someone who is in a position to start organizing some events, I'm starting to book out my calendar for 2018. So if you are somebody who wants to create an event, whether it's a workshop on how to talk about LGBTQ inclusion in the Bible, about owning your story, or about any other number of LGBTQ Christian ideas, I would love to create a panel, a workshop, a keynote address, some kind of amazing event on your campus, at your church, in your community. And you can go to thekevingarcia.com to contact me. But let's go ahead and get the ball rolling, get some stuff booked out for 2018, because y'all, it is going to be a fun year. We're already seeing so much progress in our country, honestly. Like, if you didn't see the news this past week, we had so many trans individuals, so many people of color, so many people who are other than Christian who are elected to public office. That's incredible. So if you are somebody who wants more incredible things, you know where to find me. That's all I've got to say for this week, so thank you for listening to another episode of A Tiny Revolution. Go see a therapist, be kind to yourself, take a nap if you need to, make sure you're getting outside, make sure you're talking to somebody about your feelings. Go to church if you can. Find yourself a dope community. Like, I'm about to go to church in like 20 minutes, which is why I have to hurry on this recording. But I love you. You're amazing. And God loves you so much. I'll talk to you soon, friends. Bye.